The humid, suffocating air of the Pacific jungle clung to the soldiers as they crouched low, their bodies soaked with sweat and fear. The date was January 21, 1942, and the Australian 39th Battalion had found itself entrenched in the dense, unforgiving rainforests of Papua New Guinea. A thick mist rose from the earth, swirling around their faces as they lay in wait. Ahead of them, through the tangle of vines and the shadows of towering trees, the enemy was coming, silent, relentless, and well-prepared. The Japanese, veterans of brutal campaigns across China and Southeast Asia, had already proven themselves formidable, their reputation growing with each victory. But now, in the wilds of the Pacific, they would face an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. The Australians were not just soldiers. They were survivors, tested in the crucible of trench warfare, now adapted to the rigors of the jungle. The air crackled with tension as an unseen Japanese patrol moved closer. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the faintest crack of a twig. The Australians held their breath, their eyes trained on the shifting shadows ahead. They had no time for mistakes. Every move could be their last. And yet, they remained focused, unyielding. The Japanese were formidable soldiers, but they were not prepared for the kind of warfare that the Australians had learned to fight. This was not a battle of vast, open fields where tanks and artillery reigned supreme. This was a war fought in silence and darkness, where the smallest sound could mean death, and the terrain itself became the enemy. The Australian soldiers had learned this the hard way, through trial, error, and bloodshed. The Japanese were seasoned warriors, but the Australians had become something more, masters of the jungle. The Japanese, who had swept through the Pacific with terrifying speed, now found themselves at a disadvantage. The jungle, with its dense undergrowth and treacherous terrain, offered no room for their typically coordinated tactics. The Australians, with their experience in trench warfare, understood how to use the environment to their advantage. They adapted, learning to move swiftly and silently, blending into the foliage like ghosts. The Japanese, accustomed to battlefields where they could rely on their superior firepower and disciplined formations, were ill-equipped for this new kind of war. It was a battle of patience and cunning, and in this arena, the Australians excelled. Their training had taught them to endure, to survive, and to fight in the most hostile of environments. It was this adaptability that would eventually give them the upper hand. The Australians' resolve was tested again on July 21, 1942, when the Japanese launched a full-scale assault on the Australian defensive position at Isurava. The battle was fierce, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. But as the days wore on, the Japanese began to falter. They had underestimated the Australians' ability to endure the relentless jungle warfare. The Japanese soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, found themselves caught in a deadly game of attrition. The Australians, on the other hand, had found their rhythm in the jungle. They knew how to move, how to strike, and, most importantly, how to survive. It was not a matter of brute force, but of ingenuity and determination. The Japanese could not keep up with the relentless pace, and one by one, they began to retreat by the end of the battle. The Australians had proven that they could not only survive in the jungle, but they could defeat the Japanese, the very veterans who had once seemed invincible. The victory at Isurava marked a turning point in the Pacific War. The Japanese, who had believed themselves invulnerable, now faced the grim reality that the Australians had become their equal. The jungle had changed the rules of warfare, and in this new world, it was the Australians who held the advantage. It was a lesson learned in the heat of battle, a lesson that would echo throughout the rest of the war. The Japanese, for all their experience and discipline, had failed to adapt. But the Australians had done more than adapt. They had mastered the jungle, and in doing so, they had turned the tide of the war in the Pacific. The struggle in the jungles of Papua New Guinea was not just a battle for territory, but for survival. The Australians, by this point, had been pushed to their limits. But they did not break. They did not falter. Their tenacity and their ability to endure in the most extreme conditions had made them a force to be reckoned with. And in the end, it was their understanding of the jungle and their ability to fight in it that made all the difference. As the Japanese retreated, the Australians knew they had not just won a battle. They had reshaped the very nature of warfare in the Pacific. This was no longer a fight for survival. It was a fight for dominance. And the Australians had proven that, in the jungles of the Pacific. They were the ones who would emerge victorious. It was a battle won not by firepower, but by the unbreakable will of men who had learned to fight and to survive in the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. The jungle had been their proving ground, and in its depths, they had forged a new kind of soldier, one who would go on to rewrite the history of warfare in the Pacific. The Japanese, stunned by the ferocity of the Australian defense, would not forget this lesson. As they retreated, they knew they had encountered something far more dangerous than an enemy. They had encountered a new kind of warfare, one that they were ill-prepared to face. The Australians, meanwhile, stood resolute, their eyes fixed on the future. They had proven themselves in the jungle. Now, they would turn their attention to the next phase of the war, knowing that the lessons of the jungle would carry them through to victory. The world would soon know that the Australians had not only survived the jungle, they had mastered it. And in doing so, they had defeated the Japanese veterans who had once seemed unbeatable. The Japanese retreated from Isurava, their plans shattered and their morale crumbling. They were faced with the harsh reality of a war that was rapidly slipping from their grasp. The Pacific Campaign had been one of aggressive expansion, driven by the ambition of the Imperial Army to secure the vast island chains stretching across the region. The Japanese had long prided themselves on their discipline, their precision, and their ability to overcome any adversary. But in the jungles of Papua New Guinea, all their traditional tactics seemed to falter. The terrain was unforgiving, the climate oppressive, and the very nature of the battle was unlike anything they had prepared for. The soldiers of the Imperial Army, who had once believed they could conquer any land, now found themselves trapped by an environment they could neither predict nor control. The Australians, on the other hand, had become masters of this environment. Their training in trench warfare had taught them the value of endurance and stealth, skills that were now proving invaluable in the dense, humid jungles. The Australians had learned to move with the land, using the thick undergrowth and towering trees to conceal themselves and strike from unexpected angles. They understood how to use the natural environment to their advantage, from the twisted paths that led into enemy territory to the hidden vantage points that allowed them to ambush their foes. But it wasn't just about the terrain. The Australians had developed a mentality that set them apart from the Japanese. They had learned to fight with the land, not against it, adapting their tactics to fit the shifting and unpredictable nature of the jungle warfare. This adaptability was at the core of their success. The Japanese, however, had been raised on a doctrine that prized the superiority of the infantry charge, the shock of coordinated attacks, and the overwhelming power of their artillery. They were accustomed to battles that allowed for the effective use of their logistical support and firepower, often striking with speed and efficiency. In the open fields of China or the Pacific Islands, this approach had often proved overwhelming. But in the jungle, these tactics became liabilities. The thick vegetation, the constant rain, and the oppressive humidity, all these factors neutralized much of the Japanese advantage. Artillery, tanks, and planes were useless in the dense thickets, and the disciplined formations that the Japanese so heavily relied on were ineffective in the thick of the jungle, where stealth and surprise were the only true weapons. The turning point came in August of 1942, during the Battle of Kokoda. The Japanese had pushed forward relentlessly, determined to capture Port Moresby, an important strategic location that would have provided them with a base to launch further attacks on Australia. For the Japanese, the fall of Port Moresby was critical, a step that would have solidified their control over the Pacific. But the Australians, along with their New Guinean allies, stood firm. The battle was nothing short of a nightmare for the Japanese, as the Australians utilized guerrilla tactics, sniping from concealed positions and striking swiftly, only to vanish back into the jungle before the Japanese could retaliate. The Australians understood the rhythms of the jungle better than anyone. They knew when to strike, when to retreat, and how to keep the Japanese off balance. The Japanese began to unravel. They were exhausted by the long, grueling days, burdened with the ever-present threat of ambush. The constant rains turned the trails into treacherous, muddy rivers that slowed their movements to a crawl. Supplies ran low, and the soldiers who had once been so disciplined were now worn down by the brutal conditions. The Japanese, accustomed to moving with the confidence of experienced soldiers, now found themselves plagued by self-doubt. Their intelligence had failed them. They had underestimated the Australians' resolve and their ability to adapt to the jungle. The Australians, however, were not immune to the strain. They, too, had endured hardships that would have broken lesser men. Disease, exhaustion, and the constant threat of ambush wore on them. But they refused to give up. Every soldier knew that the survival of their country depended on this battle. They were not just defending a patch of land. They were fighting for their very survival against a powerful enemy. The emotional weight of this knowledge gave them an edge that the Japanese could not match. Where the Japanese soldiers had been trained to follow orders without question, the Australians had learned to think on their feet, to adapt to an ever-changing battlefield. The Japanese strategy was becoming increasingly desperate. Their supply lines were cut, their morale shattered, and their leaders were growing increasingly frustrated. The Australian soldiers, on the other hand, were growing bolder. They knew that the Japanese could not sustain their attack much longer. It was a battle of attrition, and the Japanese were losing. But the Australians, no matter how hard the battle raged, had an unyielding resolve. They fought not just for victory, but for the survival of their country and the preservation of their way of life. This gave them a strength that could not be measured by numbers alone. By the end of September 1942, the Japanese were forced to retreat. The Australians had held their ground, and in doing so, they had delivered a devastating blow to the Japanese war effort in the Pacific. The victory at Kokoda was a turning point, not just for the Australians, but for the entire Pacific theater. It showed the world that the Japanese, for all their military prowess, were not invincible. It also proved that the Australians, when pushed to their limits, were capable of extraordinary feats of endurance and bravery. In the months that followed, the Japanese would continue their fight in the Pacific, but the Australians had made their mark. They had proven that they could not only survive in the jungle, they could dominate it. And in doing so, they had reshaped the course of the war in the Pacific, forever altering the balance of power and leaving a lasting legacy of courage, adaptability, and resilience. The Japanese would never forget the lessons learned in the jungles of New Guinea. For the Australians, the fight had only just begun. The Battle of Kokoda wound down. The Australians stood victorious, but they knew the war was far from over. The defeat of the Japanese at Kokoda was a pivotal moment, but it was only one chapter in the larger narrative of the Pacific War. The jungle had tested them like no other battlefield could, but it had also transformed them. They had learned to fight not with brute force, but with cunning, endurance, and patience. The Japanese had underestimated them, and now they would be forced to reconsider their strategies in the Pacific. But the cost of victory had been high. The Australians had paid with blood, sweat, and tears, and their victory came at a significant human cost. The terrain of the Kokoda track was unforgiving, and the soldiers had faced challenges that would break even the most seasoned of veterans. The oppressive heat, the constant rain, and the swampy, treacherous ground all combined to create an environment that was as much an enemy as the Japanese themselves. Yet the Australians had endured. They had used every ounce of their training, every lesson learned from the brutal trench warfare of World War I, to survive in the jungle. The Japanese, meanwhile, had struggled to adapt to this new kind of warfare. They had expected to fight a war of speed and precision, using their superior firepower and disciplined formations to crush their opponents. But in the jungles of New Guinea, these tactics were useless. The Australians had become adept at using the jungle to their advantage, striking from concealed positions and melting back into the undergrowth before the enemy could react. The battle at Kokoda was a turning point not just for the Australians, but for the entire Allied war effort in the Pacific. The defeat of the Japanese had serious strategic implications. Port Moresby, the key to Japanese ambitions in the Pacific, had been saved, and the Japanese were forced to reconsider their plans for expansion. The Australians, once seen as a secondary force in the Pacific, had now proven their worth. They had shown that they could hold their own against the Japanese, and that they had the resolve and ingenuity to defeat an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. But while the Australians celebrated their victory, the cost of the battle was apparent. Over 600 Australian soldiers had been killed, and many more were wounded. The casualty rate was high, and the toll on the soldiers' bodies and minds was immense. The physical exhaustion was only part of the story. The psychological scars would last long after the battle ended. Many soldiers who had fought at Kokoda would never fully recover from the trauma they had experienced. The isolation, the constant danger, the struggle for survival, it all took its toll. And yet, the soldiers carried on. They knew that their efforts had been instrumental in turning the tide of the war in the Pacific, and that the future of their country depended on their resilience. The Australian forces continued their campaign in the Pacific. They would face many more challenges, but the lessons learned in the jungles of Papua New Guinea would serve them well in the months and years to come. The Japanese, meanwhile, would find themselves increasingly on the defensive. Their attempts to advance in the Pacific would be thwarted at every turn, and they would be forced to fight on multiple fronts. The defeat at Kokoda, combined with the battles at Milne Bay, Guadalcanal, and later in the Solomon Islands, marked the beginning of the end for the Japanese in the Pacific. In the years that followed, the Australians would continue to play a vital role in the Allied victory in the Pacific. Their expertise in jungle warfare, their adaptability, and their tenacity would make them indispensable to the overall Allied war effort. The Japanese, who had once thought they could crush the Australians, now faced a determined enemy who had learned how to fight in the harshest conditions imaginable. The jungle, which had been a place of death and danger, had become a crucible that forged a new kind of warrior, one who would go on to reshape the future of warfare in the Pacific. But it was not just the soldiers who played a role in the victory. The engineers, the technicians, and the supply chains that supported the Australian forces were just as crucial to the success of the campaign. The maintenance of equipment, the development of new weapons and tools, and the logistical support that kept the troops supplied with food, ammunition, and medical care were all vital to the success of the campaign. These behind-the-scenes efforts often went unrecognized, but without them, the Australians would not have been able to carry on the fight. The engineers who developed the vehicles that could navigate the treacherous jungle paths, the workers who produced the weapons and ammunition, and the medics who treated the wounded, they were all part of the victory at Kokoda. Their contributions were as important as the soldiers who fought in the front lines, and their legacy would live on long after the war ended. As the war in the Pacific continued to unfold, the Australians' victory at Kokoda would become a symbol of their resolve and determination. It was a reminder that, no matter how difficult the odds, no matter how daunting the enemy, the Australians could stand firm. The Japanese, who had once believed that they were unbeatable, had learned a hard lesson in the jungles of New Guinea. And the Australians, who had once been underestimated, had proven that they were a force to be reckoned with. The victory at Kokoda was not just a military success. It was a triumph of the human spirit, a testament to the strength, resilience, and courage of those who fought in the jungle against all odds. The legacy of those soldiers would live on, inspiring future generations to face adversity with the same determination and courage that had carried the Australians through the darkest days of the war.